Very proud to be the chair of the RCI Science, and welcome to our third lecture of our 168th season. Thank you everyone who's taken the time to become a member of RCI Science. We appreciate your support. And what do we got up here? Interpreting the world with the machines. Okay, this is our talk today. Okay, so we go. I saw something about membership earlier on, so we do thank you. Hands in the air, how many are members? Yep. How many are non-members? Not members? Not members yet? Please find out about it and talk to Kirsten at the back because it is free to come to these lectures. It's open to everybody, but we do encourage you, if you enjoy them, to become a member. A few upcoming events. January 25th is the foundation lecture, Where Captain Nemo Got It Right and Wrong, Life in the Deep Earth. And Dr. Sherwood Lawler of the University of Toronto discusses her discovery of the world's most ancient water and the clues it holds to the origin of life on Earth. This talk will be held at the Li Ka-ching Knowledge Institute at Summit Hospital, located at 209 Victoria Street on the northeast corner of Victoria and Shooter. So if you want to know more about that, talk to Kirsten, where it is. It is free, but we do ask you to register. The foundation lectures are presented with NSERC and Ryerson University and were created to commemorate the 150th year of RCI Science. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Mario Pinto, the president of NSERC, and Dr. John Polanyi, namesake for the NSERC Award and one of Canada's most recognized living scientists, Nobel Prize winner, and RCI Fleming Award winner. So next Sunday, Dr. Christina Ray from the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada speaks on her research into the illustrative and misunderstood wolverine. We are also going to try something new with our hospitality at this lecture. So please come and put your food critic hat on and make sure we see if you like what we got. I don't know what it is, but I'm looking forward to it. February 12th, we present a showcase of Banting Research Foundation grant recipients, and these will be featuring 3 early-stage scientists. So this is going to be really interesting. Three young people early in their career are going to be summarizing their research. February 26th is a panel discussing concussions, science, policy, and sport. And we also have the Mississauga lectures starting February the 2nd with the science behind the chocolate, the science behind why chocolate tastes so good. And on March 5th, we present a program of newly arrived refugees from Syria with a presentation in both English and Arabic about climate science. There will also be hands-on experiments presented by Let's Talk Science. And we will not have a lecture on the Sunday, the February 5th or 19th. So we're here today. We're looking forward to hearing a fascinating topic. I'm sure you all have heard something about the pros and cons of artificial intelligence. Richard Zemel is a professor of computer science at the University of Toronto. Prior to that, he was the faculty at the University of Arizona in computer science and psychology and a postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute and the Carnegie Mellon University. Told me today that he's from Montreal, but spent a lot of his career in Pittsburgh, so he's a Steeler fan. I've assured him he's going to be able to get out of here well before 6:30. He was going to bring his shirt, but he didn't. But anyway, we wish your team well, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great. So thanks very much for the invitation to speak here. It's an illustrious group of speakers I saw on the website, and it looks like a great series. So I wanted to talk to you today. It's kind of a long title. A shorter title for it would be Ensuring Fair Decisions. Okay? So that's really the aim of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's say you're online and you're browsing, and you and your friend are both looking at the same web page, and you look over and see that she has this really nice ad, and you've got some ad that you really aren't interested in. So you might be wondering, why wasn't I shown this ad? Okay? And in general, the idea is that that's just one example of decisions that are being made behind the scenes by automated systems. All right? So in that case, there's a decision being made that which ad to show you, all right, as you're browsing in the system. So all kinds of other decisions are being made all the time. Sometimes we're aware, sometimes we aren't, but things like, what kind of insurance rates we're going to get, healthcare decisions like, how long you're going to have to wait for an operation, these types of questions. What schools you're going to get into. In my field, it's big. What paper, if you send in a paper, is it accepted or not? And some of that is automated as well. What kind of financial aid we get. All kinds of these questions. And also, targeted advertising is now really commonplace, and sometimes it leads to bad practices. So the idea, what I'm going to talk about, are the kinds of bad practices that come out often in advertising and in all these other automated classification decisions. Okay. So here's an example of what I mean by what we're worried about. So when I said the word fairness, what the concern is discrimination. So the population includes all kinds of minorities, and those could be ethnic or religious, medical, whatever kind of minorities. And some of that is protected by law or by ethics, but there's a lot that isn't. And so the question is, if we can't really control the data, right, how can we control what decisions are made based on it? Right? So it's very difficult, we've found out, to control what kind of data we give up. Right? So if you have your cell phone tracks everything you do, right? Knows all the kinds of things that you're looking at, what you're clicking on, everything, and same thing with your computer. Right? So it's very difficult to control your data. But the question is, can you regulate how it's used and what kinds of decisions are being made on the basis of it? So here's a couple examples just to give you an idea. So Capital One, so let's say a user visits CapitalOne.com to get a credit card. So Capital One uses a tracking company to get information to personalize the offers that are given to that person. Okay? So there is, so some people, based on their browsing history, might get a really nice offer with a low rate of interest, and other people will get a much higher rate. All right? So the idea is that there's been lawsuits raised where that minorities are being steered into higher rates. Okay? This is a very old example of redlining, where this is a map of Philadelphia. And here, in this case, the houses and businesses that were shown in red couldn't get loans or mortgages. And generally, these were low-income neighborhoods, but often they weren't. And it includes some middle and upper-income black neighborhoods. So this is an old map, but just to show you that this idea has been around for quite a while, which is these are the kinds of discrimination that has existed for in voting for a long time, but it also still exists online in ways that are not very well known right now. Okay. So here's something that's a kind of, so there's one kind of bias which would say, am I shown a good rate or am I not shown a good rate? Right? There's a more subtle bias, which is all the time when you're searching on the web. So this is an example that if somebody did a search for CEO, just did a web search for CEO, you could type this into Google or something, and this is what came up. Right? Okay? And you'll see that it's all men, except for down here in this corner. Down here in this corner is this picture. It was actually interesting because it turns out that this image is something that came from The Onion, the satirical newspaper The Onion. So it's even, I thought that made it even funnier. So the idea is that this kind of bias exists all the time in the online systems that we're always on. Right? And so people tried to make this more formal and look at it. They developed a program called AdFisher. And what that does is it simulates, so Google was aware of this and realized that people wanted to tailor themselves a little bit to say what they're interested in so that they'd be shown ads that they were appropriate to their interests. Right? And you could also turn that off so that you wouldn't be shown ads appropriate to your interests. And so then there was this test run by these researchers at Carnegie Mellon, where they simulated some user profiles. Google has an ad settings page that you can go to, and you can set your interests on that page, what kinds of topics you're interested in, things. about your gender, whatever you want to say on that page. And then what they did is they analyzed what traits actually showed up and affected which ads were shown. Right? So they could set the ads and then change some of the traits and see how that affected which ads were shown. And so it was a study where they actually did had about 17,000 simulated users for this. Okay? And the results were interesting. They found that men, in general, when the gender was set to men, they got more ads for executive level positions, executive level salary positions, and women got more ads for things like goodwill and for job hunting services and various other things. Right? They also found that based on the browsing history of these simulated users, that would change what kind of ads were shown. Right? So if they did browsing for substance abuse, it would be much more likely to get an ad for drug and rehabilitation services. Right? So in general, the finding was that two things. First of all, that the ad fisher found that there was different traits directly did affect ads in ways that maybe were undesirable, but also it was very hard to predict. Okay, so that was another thing. And so, in general, the conclusion of this wasn't that Google has some sort of pernicious desire to bias against people. It's more a little bit that the ad system is out of control, right? And it's very hard for Google to control it because there's a lot of things that go underneath what ad is shown to what person. Some of it does come from the advertiser targeting particular people. The advertiser says, I want to, there's a group that's known as the white picket fence group. And so they can target a particular segment of society and say, these are the kind of people we think that are appropriate to these ads. So an advertiser can do that. The Google's also determining the relevance. They have a ranking system that says what's the likely that this ad is relevant for this particular person. And a lot of this depends on the user action. So your past actions, what web page you viewed, how long you stayed on a page, what you've clicked on, what you've purchased. Not just you, but a lot of other people. It's a problem called collaborative filtering, where it's trying to predict what you're going to buy or what you're going to be interested in on the basis of not only your past history, but other people that are like you. So that's like what Amazon uses and Netflix. You're probably familiar with. Netflix uses when they say, what movies you're going to like, or what Amazon uses when they say other people like you, who bought this also purchased this other thing. So those are both instances of collaborative filtering where they're trying to use other people's profiles to match with yours and predict what you're going to like. And the same thing happens on ad targeting. So all of these things make it very hard to control and get rid of any bias in the ad system. So that's just advertising. This happens all over the place. So here's an example. There's lots of cases where algorithms are used to make decisions, and you have to be careful that social and legal discrimination doesn't take place. So here's an example where there's a learning algorithm that found for a particular company that the best employer was one that lived close to the job and had reliable transportation and used a few social networks. Right? And the conclusion of this was practices that are, I'll read it to you, even unintentionally filter out older or minority applicants can be illegal under federal equal opportunity laws. If the hiring practice is challenged as discriminatory, a company must show the criteria it's using are proven to predict successes in the job. So the idea was that this may be optimal for predicting whether somebody's going to be a good employee, right? But it could turn out to be discriminatory against particular people. Similarly for lending decisions. So this was an article a couple of years ago for banking startups that are using these tools for lending and trying to decide who's an appropriate person to offer a loan to for the bank. And I'll just, you pick out a couple sentences here. Applying the modern techniques of data science to consumer lending raises questions. So how can you enforce anti-discrimination? Right? Because what it's doing is making decisions on the basis of past data. And the past data, it said, so here's what you want to have in mind. You have past data, and you build a system that's going to encode often whatever the biases that were existing in the past data. So in the past data, if it happened to be that women were denied loans more often than men, and you build a learning system that tries to predict whether somebody should get the loan or not based on the criteria, right, that of what's presented, then often it'll have to encode the same biases that were existent in the past. Okay? So the question is, how can we build something that has more control in it than just that? Can straightforward machine learning just would build something that would encode those past biases. So I should take, as an aside about my interest, so this isn't my main research area. My main research area is a kind of artificial intelligence where I look at questions like, how can you build a computer system that can learn how to understand what's in an image or what's in a video? Right? So how can you, based on lots of experience with looking at videos or lots of experience at just looking at images. So I'm interested in those kinds of questions about understanding the content of images and video and some building programs that can automatically pull that out. But then I became aware of all this work that was going on where people were using machine learning in ways that affected everybody's daily life, like these lending decisions, employment decisions, and all these things. And I decided, hey, this is something where machine learning is actually being used, but there's some problems with how it's being used. And these are some examples of the problems that's being used. And the question is, can we do something to overcome that and provide some hooks that would allow somebody to avoid some of this discrimination? So that's how I got interested in this problem. Okay? And one thing that's been established that applies to this is called the law of disparate impact. And this is something well established in the legal field. And it basically says this, that a company's liable, if its practices have a disproportionate impact on individuals based on these protected characteristics. Right? So it's called the law of disparate impact. And this can be, the company's liable even if they unknowingly discriminate. So there's an old example of this. This was in the Supreme Court, Griggs versus the Duke Power Company, many years ago. And they said that they found that the standard kind of screening that companies were doing weren't lawful because it violated the law of disparate impact. They can't require an intelligence test or a high school diploma, right? Because those weren't shown to be directly important for the job. And then, and it was unfairly biased against groups in the population. Right? So that's been around a long time, but it's been difficult to enforce. And the new thing is that that's now being enforced for online systems. Okay? So the governments are becoming more and more aware of this issue with online systems. So in the US, the Federal Trade Commission recently charged a home mortgage company had failed to review, monitor, examine, or analyze loan prices, right? Including overages for African Americans and Hispanic applicants. Right? So the idea was they were charged much more. Their charge for going over was much higher. Right? And just last year, then President Obama published a report about big data, and so showing again that they were very aware. They had a whole commission on big data, and they showed that these kinds of disparate impacts were something to be aware of. Right? And just recently, last year, the European Union published something called the Data Protection Regulation. And one of the things in this, it says when personal data is collected, it can't be processed in a way that's incompatible with its original purposes. Right? And part of this is actually about fairness, about non-discrimination, using it in a way that discriminates against individuals. So governments are becoming more and more aware of it. So the question is, what can we do as computer scientists? That's what people who build these machine learning systems to help facilitate this idea that you want to ensure fairness. Right? So now we get into the kind of work that I do on this. And this is the setup that we have, where if you think back to what I was saying about the Capital One, where you have a tracking company that's tracking users and gathering information about users. And then what Capital One is, it gets the information about the users from the tracking company. It decides which ads are going to go to which group of people that were tracked. Okay, so the tracking, in other words, say this is a white picket fence male between 25 and 35, and this, they put them into bins. They put all the users into some bins. So that's one way that it works. And then the advertiser, like Capital One, will decide who, what ads go to which bin, to which type of person. Okay? Does everybody get this? Feel free to interrupt me and ask questions if things aren't clear. Okay. So what we have is a representation where you think of the original representation of the person. So that could be your browsing history, whatever demographic information we might have, the online system has about you. It could be lots of things. It could be, so we could just call that as some X. That's a description of an individual. Okay? And out here is a vendor action. That's why. That's going to be some decision about, for this individual at this time, which ad am I going to show? Okay, that's the decision that's being made. You can think of it as a classification decision. Trying to decide, it's classifying that user to say which of all the ads that I could show is the most appropriate ad at this time for that user. Okay? So that's why. And what we introduced, and this is work with my colleagues, we introduced something which is this intermediate representation. So it's already there in some sense. It's already there because, like I said, this part is being done by the tracking system, and they give a representation of the individuals to the vendor, like Capital One, and Capital One decides who to show the ads to. Okay? So it's this two-step process. The original person gets described by some belonging to some group, and then the vendor decides what ads to show to what group. Okay? And now, and just for the purposes of the talk, we're going to think about it where we have protected attributes. The protected attribute could be called S, and S could be something like gender. Okay? So S equals 1 could be that females, and S equals 0 is males. All right? So we've separated population based on who is in the protected group and who isn't. All right? So in this case, we could have the protected group being females. It could be based on race or any other thing, but just for the purposes of the description, we're going to think of it as just a single variable that just says in the protected group or not. Okay, that's what S is. So our goal is to achieve fairness, not necessarily in terms of the decisions that are being made, but fairness in this mapping from the original person to this representation. All right? And the reason for this, so let me explain why, is that we think of it as we have a vendor that we're going to assume, we don't know who the vendor is. We don't necessarily trust the vendor. We can't necessarily audit the vendor. So it's very hard to go in for every vendor and say, make sure that they're being fair. Okay? So instead, this part of it where we're able to come up with representations of individuals is something that is under society's control, potentially. Right? You can regulate that. So we have this mapping that takes X to some representation, and the idea is that is going to, right now that's the ad network, and we want to replace that, and, well, we can still be an ad network, but we want to include some society oversight there. Right? So this is society saying it's important to try to enforce fairness, that when we do something in this step such that our untrusted, unknown vendors can't be unfair or can't discriminate. Okay, so that's how we formulated the problem. And I should say that there's other formulations that are different, and I'm not going to do a lot of comparisons, but the other formulations are more about the decisions that are being made and directly trying to affect the decisions. Okay? And I'll say a little bit about the advantages of doing it the way I'm describing in a bit. So you might think of, okay, so our goal is to be fair in this step, that is to come up with representations that about the individuals where you don't know. Ideally, what you'd like to do is remove any information about whether this person is in the protected group or not. Right? So that's the main idea here in our formulation, which is if we can come up with a mapping of an individual that loses the information about, for instance, whether that person's male or female, then it doesn't matter what the vendor does, he can't discriminate against females. Okay, so that's the idea. So you might say, well, that should be easy. Why don't we just take the description of the individual and take out that one bit, that one thing S that says, is it a male or female? Okay, so you want to remove that and not give that to this, not have that be part of this mapping, this description of the individual. All right? It turns out that that's not sufficient because the membership in S may be encoded in some of the other dimensions. So if you think about it, all the description of your browsing history, what you've bought. Imagine that, we're talking Amazon or something. So all the things you've bought on Amazon, all the things you've clicked on, whatever you viewed, all those things. If we take out of your profile whether you're a male or female, it still may be possible by looking at what you've bought to predict whether you're male or female with high confidence. Okay? So there's all these other attributes that are correlated with something like gender or correlated with whatever that protected attribute is. So it's not as easy as just removing that bit. Okay? So this is an example just to show you how that's the case. So this is not necessarily about fairness, but more about privacy and anonymization. So this was several years ago. In the 90s, the Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission, for the purpose of research, what they did is they released some anonymized data. And they took all the state employees and all the history of hospital visits that the state employees went to. They released all of that for research purposes. Right? And they didn't want to, they wanted to anonymize the data so to protect privacy, so they removed the name, address, and social security from that data. All right. There was a graduate student at the time who said that, wait a second, that's not good enough, okay? That the data really isn't anonymous when you do that. And what she showed, this is her, LaTanya Sweeney's her name, she showed that the governor of Massachusetts himself could be identified very easily in this data. And the way she did it is that she knew that he was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge isn't that big, and you can get the voter rolls from Cambridge. And she cross-referenced the voter rolls in Cambridge with this insurance data. And just knowing his birth date, his gender, and his zip code, she was able to narrow it down to exactly who that person was. Right? That is, the voter rolls had all this other information that she could use to, just based on this to figure out which hospital records were his. Right? And so, to make it a little dramatic, she actually sent to him his full history of all the things that were diagnosed and everything else to his office. Okay? So that caused quite a stir. And so in general, it's been good and bad in my point of view. As a researcher, there's a lot of data that's released. It's very interesting, and you can do a lot of research on it. And this kind of killed research and, for quite a while, because you found that it's very hard to anonymize data, right? And she followed this up. She showed later that, just given the zip code, birth date, and gender, that you could identify to the person, to the individual, 87% of African Americans. So that just goes to show you that anonymization is very difficult. That even if you remove some information, there's a lot of other information in the record that encodes all kinds of things that may be correlated with things that you don't want to know, you don't want to release. In this case, it was about identity. In the other case, what I've been talking about with the fairness is we don't want to release whether the person is a male or a female, for example. Okay? So it's not good enough to just remove that bit to say whether they're a male or female, because all the other information will allow you to figure it out, just like she did. Okay, so what we did is come up with a name for this. We called it fairness through awareness. Okay, and I won't go through the equations, but the basic idea is that think of it as there's two kinds of formulation. So a lot of this is about what's the right definition of fairness. That's the challenge in a lot of this work. So one thing is what we call individual fairness, and that is the idea that you want to treat similar individuals similarly, okay, at an individual level. And the second one is a group fairness notion that says you want to equalize the two groups. So you have the S plus group. Those are the people that S equals 1, like the females in the example I was giving. And you have the S minus group. Those would be the males. And you want to treat those two groups equally, right, at the level of the outcomes. Right? So this is more like things like you're familiar with, I'm sure, like, quotas or affirmative action get at this type of thing. To say, this group, to overcome past biases and discrimination, this group should, gain more acceptance to law school or whatever the case might be. Okay? So the group fairness idea has been well explored. Individual fairness, less so. So that's the image I showed at the beginning. We call it fairness through awareness. That's the awareness part of it, because the idea is that we're aware whether the person is in the group, the protected group or not, when the decisions are being made. And in our case, when the representation is being constructed of that individual. Because we're going to do that differently based on what group they're in, okay? In order to maintain fairness. All right? And it requires some understanding of the task itself and also understanding of the protected groups. Okay? So that's our overall setup. We have this group. We have these two groups, S equals one group, S equals 0. The society is going to map it to some representation that's going to be sent to the vendor. And there's two aims. In this representation, we first want to lose the information about S. Okay? And the way to think about that is, like I said, we aren't going to be able to do that by just getting rid of this bit S equals 0 versus S equals 1, but we can come up with a representation here such that if you give a person that representation or a new machine learning system that representation, it can't reconstruct whether S equals 0 or S equals 1. Okay? So it's a more complicated thing. It's not just removing that bit, but it's actually finding some mappings that loses that information. And the claim is if we've done that, and then we give the vendor that representation, the vendor will not be, if there's lost all the information about whether this person is in S, then the vendor can't discriminate on the basis of S. Okay? But we want to preserve the rest of the information so that the vendor can maximize the utility. I mean, you can easily remove the information from S by just coming up with a random description of the individual, right? And so just a random description or the same description for everybody, right? And obviously, the vendor will never buy into this scheme, right? Capital One would never allow this to happen because their ads would be just given randomly to different people. So there has to be some trade-off here. So one of the main ideas in this work is that there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs between the vendor's utility and society's aims. The vendor has a utility, let's say, to maximize profitability, right? They want to give the interest rate such that they're going to get the most profitable, most profit out of their customers. But society, at the same time, is trying to ensure that there's not discrimination. Okay? So it's those trade-offs that are being embodied here, in that we want to lose information about S, that's enforcing fairness, but preserving information so the vendor can maximize their utility. Okay? And we have ways of doing this that uses concepts from information theory, using maximum information between this variable and this variable. We want to maximize that and minimize the mutual information between this variable and that variable. Right? And we have mechanisms for doing that. I won't tell you too much about those, but I'll show you some example of experiments that we run. So what we do is we get data off the web, different kinds of data. So one is some very old data from a bank, German credit data it's called, and you want to classify whether an individual is a good or a bad credit risk. Okay? The kind of thing you might use to make loan decisions. Okay? And what we did is we took that data and we designated one sensitive feature. Remember we said S equals 1 or 0, so we said age, if somebody's old or not. We just had a threshold, and they said S equals 1 is if they're above 55, I think it was in this data, and young if they're less than that. Okay? And then we wanted to see, can we make something that does a good job based on the past data of estimating whether or not somebody is a good or bad credit risk at the same time, and it's not discriminating on the basis of age. Okay, so we did the same thing with these two other data sets. One is called the adult income data set, predicting whether the income is greater than $50,000. And then the heritage health data set was quite interesting because it was a big data set, 147,000 patients in this case. And our task was to predict whether the patient was going to spend any nights in the hospital or not on the basis of the information when they were admitted to the hospital. And the sensitive feature here is age, because the notion here in terms of fairness is that you don't want, and this would be in the US, you wouldn't want necessarily an HMO to decide, well, on the basis of these attributes, we think that this person is going to require nights of stay in the hospital, and therefore we're going to refuse them care at the hospital. Okay? So that's the kind of thing, the fairness notion in the health setting. And we did a bunch of experiments where, like I said, we're trading off accuracy against discrimination. And these are comparisons between our method and the degree of accuracy where you're trying to get up to 100% accuracy and have very low discrimination. And these are, again, some other methods, like I was saying. The other methods are doing something where they aren't creating this intermediate representation Z. Instead, they're just mapping to outcomes and trying to make the outcomes be fair, more like you might do for affirmative action or that type of thing, right? And what you see is ours is the one shown in purple over here, and that we get pretty good accuracy. That is how well we predict the right answer on held-out data. That's what accuracy means. So it's pretty good, almost as good as the other methods in most cases. But our discrimination is considerably lower. Okay, so it's off a little bit of discrimination here, and it's off the charts there. Okay, so it's enabled us to tune that trade-off such that we can get very low discrimination but maintain high accuracy. And we've improved it since then with so-called deep network. I won't go into details about that. Maybe you've heard about deep learning. That's a kind of new thing in machine learning that is very popular and getting very good results in all kinds of different domains. Like I was talking about, image understanding and scene understanding that I work on, and autonomous driving, all those kinds of things. A lot of deep learning in there. We've also applied deep learning in this setting. And this is just to give you a little bit of a visualization of what's happening. So I mentioned that there's this intermediate representation. That's this high-dimensional representation. Okay, like you can't really say. So originally the data is about like how often they visited some website, what they've done, all these kinds of things that describe a user. And now we're mapping it to some abstract high-dimensional vector. Everybody has some abstract high-dimensional vector. And now we're going to just visualize those high-dimensional vectors in 2 dimensions. Okay, so we project it down to 2 dimensions. And we color it here by the 2 groups. So the red are all the people where S equals 1, and the purple are all the S equals 0 groups. Okay? And I think this was for the Heritage Health data set. And these were all the individuals. And what you see is that when we don't have this fairness criteria, you can get a good separation between the 2 groups. That is, if we gave this to a vendor, they would very easily tell that this is the S equals 0 group and this is the S equals 1 group. When we add the fairness criteria that says we have to lose information about whether somebody is S equals 0, S equals 1, these are the representations that we get. You can see that here, they all lie on top of each other. So if I give you a random point in this group, you'll have a very hard time telling, is that a red or a blue point? Okay? So that's what a vendor that's trying to figure out, is this person old or young, okay, would have a hard time telling here. Here they would have an fairly easy time. Okay? So that's some visualization of what our fairness criterion has got us. Okay, so that's what we've been doing. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing now, and then I'll wrap up. So that was mostly about group fairness. How do we capture the idea of individual fairness? So how can similar individuals be treated similarly? And this is very hard because it depends on having some metric. That is, we have to be able to say, to what extent are 2 individuals similar with respect to some classification task, okay? And this is very hard, right? Because you have groups that possibly come from very different backgrounds, and you want to say, how is this person that grew up in this part of the country with this very different, cultural basis, what is a similar instance in that group to some instance in some other group? So that's the challenge in this so-called metric, to say you want to treat similar individuals similarly, but it's hard to decide which 2 people are similar. Okay? And our claim is that's not machine learning's job. That's society's job. Right? This is where what we want society to come in and say, this is what fairness means, and and fairness from an individual level means that these 2 people are analogous and they should be treated similarly. Right? So my thinking of this is that we're building tools that have these kinds of hooks in it, so that if once society, whoever it is, the legal profession or the philosophers, whoever it is that decides these 2 people are similar, we can build a system that treats them similarly. Okay, so that's the way we're approaching this problem. Okay? And there's all kinds of examples of this is already being done in some ways. Okay. Financial insurance risk metrics, they already decide which people have similar risks in their basic, when they give them different insurance rates. Healthcare metric, how do you decide which patients, if you have some very expensive and scarce resource, how do you allocate that resource in a fair way? Right? So that's being done in the health profession all the time. And this is also something that's well known in economics and political theory. This has been studied a lot. But it hasn't been kind of operationalized at a level for everyday applications like, deciding on loans, deciding on these kinds of things. And so that's what we need in order to make these machine learning systems that we're building more fair. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to mention was a very public case that you might have heard of, a very public thing, which is, and I've gone to some workshops recently about this, it's very interesting that there's computer systems, like I've been describing, that are predicting recidivism. So recidivism is like, what's the chance of somebody, like a criminal, recommitting a crime? Okay. And all kinds of decisions these days about bail and length of sentencing, those kinds of things are being made on the basis of computer systems that look at the person's history and decides what's the probability that this person is likely to commit another crime. Okay? And they come up with some score, right? And of what's the risk that they're going to commit another crime. And on the basis, and the judge sees that and takes that into account during sentencing or bail or anything else. And I must say, from my point of view, having learned at these workshops about what's gone into building these systems that are giving these scores, it's quite scary because they aren't very good systems. They're built on very little data, partly because the record keeping is bad and partly because of privacy issues, that they have very little information about the individual, and they're coming up with a number that is really going to have a huge impact on that person's future in terms of whether they stay in jail or or how long they stay in jail. Okay? So this was something that made the news. It was used where a company came up with, and these are their scores that they got, these two people. She stole a little kid's bike, and she had some past history of shoplifting. And he robbed a Home Depot store, and he also had some history of crimes in the past. And she was estimated as a very high risk and got sentenced to jail, and he was estimated low risk and got out. And she had a clean record once she got out. Everything was fine, and he committed several violent crimes very soon after getting out of jail. So this was just one case, but what they did is actually this group called ProPublica. They did a study where they looked at, in Florida, where one of these risk scoring systems was used, they looked at thousands of cases, and they studied them for the 2 years after the score was assessed and said to what extent do those people actually commit violent crimes afterwards. So in other words, they were looking at the correlation between the score and the actual outcome of whether they committed a crime or not, and they found it was very poor. Okay, so that was, and this, made a lot of the newspapers quite public. Okay, so to wrap up, so my sense in all this is that we can't just leave it up to the algorithm itself, right? So that's how I got interested in it, because I build machine learning algorithms. My students, we build machine learning algorithms, and they just run, and we think we're done with it. But this is a case where it actually is affecting people's lives in all kinds of ways. So we want to be able to allow society to have some way of specifying aims and criteria, not just the data itself. Okay? There's an inherent trade-off here that I want to emphasize again between the society's aims of avoiding bias, of trying to have something that's non-discriminatory against a group, versus a so-called decision accuracy. So this is about for the utility of a vendor or whatever it is, a school that's deciding which people get into the school, right? They want to let in the people that they think are going to be most likely to succeed in the program, right? So that's their objective. Or the most likely to donate money, whatever that might be. So that's the criteria, and so then they're trying to maximize that utility, but the claim here is we want to trade those two things off, the societal good versus the vendor's good. And the question is, what can you do about this on an individual basis? So this is what I was talking about with the metric. How can you, individual by individual, say, this person is analogous to this person, we want to make sure that they're treated similarly. And so I think to really make progress on this requires working with legal scholars and public policy experts to understand this better. Right? Like I mentioned, there's already some legal doctrine that applies, this disparate impact law. But exactly how it gets applied is open to question. Okay? And so like I said, what are some of the right goals? Is statistical parity or quotas the right goal? And how can we formulate this objective? So I came up with one, which was to remove information about whether someone's in the sensitive group or not while maximizing utility, right? So that's one definition, but there are a lot of other definitions out there. Okay? And with that, that's it. Yeah, any questions?
Two questions. Did the notorious bicycle thief Risha give you permission for her to feature in this? And the second one would be, what would be the downside of banning the whole process of mega data collection? If privacy in general is considered a good thing, why not make it more difficult for vendors and corporations? They would have to go out and do old-style surveying and so on.
Yeah.
So what would be the downside of the just banning the process? You
Right.
suggested a way of making it more fair. Thank you.
So yeah, so let me answer that question. So my feeling is that there's a lot of benefits that we get from having the data available. All right. So I think that if the system, for instance, just there's daily convenience, for example. Like I think you can, appreciate the kind of thing you get from when you're driving your car and trying to figure out how to navigate. And if you use a mapping thing, it saved my life many times getting to some meeting on time, right? Go to a new city, I know nothing about that city. I turn on the map and it tells me where there's traffic and where there isn't. And that's based on data. That's users, where they are and who's traveling and what's where. So I think there's a lot of things like that where it might not be, where it actually has improved our lives in many ways. Though getting rid of the data isn't a great idea. And I think the same thing's true on the web. Your browsing history actually is very useful to anticipate what you are interested in, what you aren't interested in. And so, for example, if you use, a lot of people use recommendation systems to help decide what movies they're going to watch and what they're going to buy. And so I think that to the extent to which that's an improvement of your daily life, and then I would say on the legal side of it, there's a lot of benefits that can be had from using it in the legal system. So, for example, there are inherent biases in the legal profession that are local. Judges have biases, people have biases. So it's not saying that computers are the only ones with biases. Obviously, people have biases. So the question is, if we can engineer it to get rid of some of the biases or mitigate some of the biases here, it's something that we can do with a computer system that we can't do with individuals. I think that's true for the legal system. It's also in the medical profession. I really think that online medicine, like being able to look at, do a lot of diagnosis and be able to say, here's some radiology imagery. I think some radiology tasks could be automated in some ways, or use an advisor that would be a lot faster and very high quality. So I think there's a lot of things that we get. My sense is, my answer is that there's a lot of things that we get from having all of this data online with very strong systems, and this is more of saying we want to make sure that it's not abused or enable a way to allow some control of the whole system.
In a real-world situation, in the X to Y model, who would really be responsible for the Z algorithm in terms of implementation, overseeing regulation? And
Yeah.
if the vendor was a big corporation like Amazon, for example, would they have any influence on that?
Yeah, so the idea there is that there's meant to be a societal regulation that would say, so there are already these tracking things. And just like I mentioned about Google having something where you can turn on or off your preferences. And so I do think it is practical to have an individual have on your, something that would be, this is in the future, but something that would control your online profile. So the idea is that just like in Google, you can say what your interests are and what they aren't. Here, the idea would be that your online profile would be something that, based on your whole history, we'd build a system that would create Z that would then be available to multiple vendors, all right? And that would be something that society would have some say over. Now, who builds that is another question, but I do think that, but I think that if there's enough of a desire from the society to have it, then we could make that commercially viable.
I was wondering if you could just give a bit more detail on how the algorithm works.
Sure. Right, so there's two versions of it. So one version of it, you can think of the Z. So what we're doing is we're taking individuals and we're representing them by, let's say, clustering them. Remember I said like people are in the white picket fence 25 to 35 male group. So that's one cluster. We have different clusters. And so a simple version of the algorithm, it says that for every cluster, there has to be an equal proportion of the two groups in that cluster. So that is, if there's 60% S equals 0 people and 40% S equals 1 in the population, that means when we assign them the clusters, every cluster has to have 60% S equals 0 and 40% S equals 1. If that's the case, if I tell you what cluster, now a person is just represented by what cluster they are in. If I tell you what cluster somebody's in, you have no way of telling whether they're male or female because they all have just the same proportion. Okay, so that was a simple version of it. There's a more complicated version where it's not just a cluster, it's this high-dimensional vector like I showed projected down before, but it has a similar idea. Yep.
Hi. Nick Bostrom, in his book Superintelligence, compares the ability of human intelligence with a split brain compared to AI, and he talks about where he thinks that human intelligence is going to be overcome by AI. Basically, I'd like to ask, during the Trump election, nobody could understand, well, why it happened, and how can you get computer programmers to program something that the human mind could not comprehend and put into numbers or programs?
My students do it all the time. There's often, well, I think it's not hard to get a program that does something that people can't comprehend, but to do it, but I think to do it in a way that is intelligent is hard, right? So that is, so you think of, computer programs that play games like AlphaGo, right? So a computer program that can play Go better than the best players in the world, right? A lot of people don't understand what's going on inside that program. So I think it's, and people often don't understand really what's going on inside the head of some expert that's playing Go. People don't understand what's going on inside the expert at Go, right? And so, but you can program some system to do really well at that kind of task. So I think that, there are cases where you can have a computer system that can act in a way that is either we can't understand how it works, right? But it can do something very impressive, or we can have the other side, which is it does something that we don't understand. Right?
I guess what I'm coming up with is we have to have more students building algorithms in the classroom for themselves so that when an advanced student like yourself comes along to pull that society data in, the students, people who already have sort of analyzed themselves.
Okay. So I do think it's a question of whether people can, so part of what I'm saying about the feasibility of this, creating this, intermediate representation, like I was saying, so part of it was whether it's viable, and part of it is people being able to understand the system well enough that they can characterize what they do want known about themselves, right? So maybe that ties in with what you were saying. And I think that also ties in a little bit with the Google ad setting, right? So that people can say what aspects of themselves that they want to be allowed to be public. And so what I'm saying in this case is not just about yourself and what you allowed to be public, or what you allowed to be taken into account by the advertising system, but more generally, should this be something that's an individual is deciding to what extent they can control whether they're getting shown something because they're a male or female, right? So it should be the fairness. Should it be an individual decision or is it a society decision, right? So should society come in and say, we're going to enforce that the representations for everybody are fair, okay? So that's one idea. Another one is more at the individual level, where you could say, I want to make it so that I don't care if the if Google knows that I'm a male and targets me for a male. So that's more of the individual side of it. So I think this gets back at your question about feasibility, that another way of doing it that makes it feasible is to allow things to be, when it's personal taste like this, allows things to be fair if you care, fair if you want it to be, and fair and unfair if you don't. That's another possible way of making it more feasible. But when it comes to something where it's true discrimination like employment practices, then society, I think, has to step in and decide that it has to be fair.
Recently in The Economist, there was an article about a system in India which seems to have been enthusiastically embraced by large segments of the population. So people voluntarily register all sorts of personal data. And the claim is that this makes it very much easier to obtain a mortgage, to obtain a credit card, and hence the public support for it. Do you have any, obviously that raises serious ethical
Yeah.
questions. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's related to the point earlier about, why don't we just get rid of the online system, because, it brings up dangers, but it also brings up a lot of benefits, right? So it makes, in this case, but I think it's also people on social networks use it in all kinds of ways, and they find that they give up their privacy, they give up all kinds of information about themselves that later they regret that happening. So it's a question in this case, I'm not aware of this particular one, but there certainly are a lot of benefits to having all that data available in terms of making decisions that are taking into account all the characteristics. So if you go back to the law example I said, imagine we really could build a very good recidivism predictor. That is, we had all this individual information about an individual. It all was online, just like this case you're talking about, and we had all their past practices. We had a lot of data that we were trained on, so we could really build a very good predictor that we could, with high confidence, say whether somebody was going to commit a crime or not. I would say that would be great, right? Because then it really is data where we can make an informed decision. That is how a judge that chooses to use that is another question. But at least we have something that is some data that is, because that is what usually goes into bail and goes into all these other things is, what's the likelihood that somebody's going to commit a crime? So my feeling is that in the ideal world where we could build a great predictor, then I think that it will make society better and will improve things, as long as that can be balanced against things like fairness.
What you've been describing, is it a product?
Is it what?
Is it a product? Is it something you could actually sell to Google or other vendors?
Yeah.
To provide companies with protection against being sued? Is that what you envision, or actually envision it being something that's regulated and enforced such that these advertising networks must actually comply with something like that?
Yeah. So it's more the latter. It's not right now thought of as a product, but it's something that would be like, I think of it as a way that, a service in a way. You could say, here's your data, and now, give us the kind of thing that you want to do, and they could be sold this way as a service. We'll say, here's your data, now we're going to create a representation for you that you can then sell to Google or sell to whoever else, or like taking the place of the targeting, the tracking network I was talking about, and in the targeting example. So the tracking network would then subscribe to this service because they have to. Society regulates it and says they have to, and therefore they're going to take the mapping of individuals to some groups and do it in a fair way using these kinds of ideas.
Certain industries that are subject to regulation would have to run through your filters.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
In the legal context, one of the things that would make the intermediate representation particularly useful to a vendor would be that it was admissible as proof that they could not have discriminated because the information is extracted.
That's right.
Has there been any test case on whether the courts will accept that? Because your first challenge is the lawyers may not be understanding what you're talking about. Secondly, the courts may not accept it as being generally accepted science.
Right. Yeah. So this.
You don't want to use something that's easily available. Robert Gere has a way of tracking sociopaths, and that results
So not yet. So this is still at the level of writing papers about it and not trying to actually get it into products. So this is, I have gone to like some. I went to a workshop, kind of civil rights workshop in Washington last year, where there was discussions about algorithms in the courts, and I brought up this idea. People thought it was interesting. But in terms of actually getting it implemented is another step to get it accepted. But it is exactly, the aim is exactly like you said, because a vendor or in the legal system, they could say if the decision was made based on a representation that did actually have no information about race or something, then then they're kind of free from any claims of bias. But it's a question of being able to get there in a real system. Yes. Yeah, so I said S equals 1, S equals 0 is a simple way of doing it, but we can also deal with continuums as well.
I'm just curious, you might not like this question, but if you want to set up filters to bring about equality and justice and so on, but how are you going to distinguish between, or how are you going to determine whether the filters themselves have actually gone over to the big brother is watching you sphere? You know what I mean?
Right. Well, all of this is under like my aim in this is not to create a big brother, but it's to allow society to say, to the extent to which we believe that society should set laws. Right. This is like a kind of law, like the discrimination law, being in effect in these systems. So it's it's big brotherish to the extent to which laws are big brotherish. I think that's the.
Are you going to have some kind of a system to control that we don't?
Yeah, so the idea is that this would be transparent, so that there would be something that would be, like I said, with the metric, we would say which individuals are comparable, and that would be information that would be input into the system. So it's transparent. So if people want to control it, or it should be obvious to anybody what the criteria are that are going into the system.
Okay, great.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Everybody.